We all love plants, but to the untrained eye, they seem quite uneventful. They're rooted to the spot. They look like they're at the mercy of their environment. But actually, plants are very clever creatures, and they're able to adapt to the environment and their surroundings in ways that animals can only dream of. So, for instance, a plant in a low nutrient environment will divert resources from the shoots to the roots, produce more roots to farm the soil to find more nutrients. Very clever thing that animals can't do. Also, supplied with a lot of fertilizer, particularly nitrogen, they will produce long shoots, more buds, in an attempt to complete their life cycle and flower. So they can adapt in more ways than you think. But it's all about getting a balance between all the factors involved. But I just want to focus in on things like pH, temperature, fertilizer, the water, and the media. And if we can get these things in balance and match the plant's actual demand for these inputs, we can get a better, healthier plant without lots more inputs. And again, it's down to monitoring and planning, and it all comes together in a quality plant. Plants can do a lot for themselves. They can synthesize most of the materials they need themselves from water and the environment and sunlight. But there are things that they need. But let's get it in perspective. Most of the carbon, the hydrogen, and the oxygen the plant needs, it can produce itself. So 95% of the nutrients within a plant, it assimilates itself, without much input from ourselves. The other elements that we go on and on about all the time, NPKs and all these sort of things, only make up 5% of what a plant needs. So these are the sort of elements that we commonly talk about. We talk about NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. We talk about minor elements like calcium and magnesium, and also trace elements. They're all equally essential to the plant. They're just required in different quantities. So if we took a plant and broke it down into its building blocks, its atoms, you would find that for every million parts of nitrogen, there would only be 1 part of molybdenum, and that's key to why molybdenum is a trace element. But they're all equally as important. So if we don't get them in balance, if we don't supply them in the correct quantities, the plants will be deficient. And there's an analogy to Liebig's barrel where the growth can be limited by one factor that's short. So if the plant is short of iron, it'll exhibit deficiency symptoms that will affect the plant. It can have plenty of all the other nutrients, but one thing can affect the growth of the plant. So it's all about the weakest link in the chain, and that's what we're trying to eliminate to get the best quality. So if we look at pH to start with, it's a key thing. We talk about it all the time, but what is pH? Well, it's really a logarithmic scale on the amount of hydrogen ions in solution. The key thing to understand is that it's a logarithmic scale, and if you move by 1 pH unit, it can be 10 times as acidic or alkaline as the previous number. But if you move by 2 pH units, you're 100 times. So there's quite a difference between pH 5 and pH 7. Yeah, so it's important we understand what we're talking about, whether we're talking about the pH of the growing media or the pH of the water. And they have different effects. So looking at the water first, you typically take a sample regularly. Most people would take a sample every year, and you would have different water sources. Traditionally, people have used mains or borehole water, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to get licenses and to afford the rates for the water. So more and more people are recycling water or collecting winter rainfall in a reservoir, and they all have different properties. So when we talk about the pH, it is important, but it's also important to look at the alkalinity. And that's a measure of the hardness of the water. We would typically take a water sample, and then we can look at various things from the conductivity, how salty the water is, to the other elements involved, and just to see what the bicarbonate level is. You get different sorts of water. This is hard water that you'd expect to see from most mains water or borehole. The pH is 7.4, which is quite high. But the key thing is the alkalinity down at the bottom, which is 216. So anything over 150 is very hard water, and it has an effect on the availability of the nutrients. It also means there's a lot of what we call ballast salts in the water, which increase the conductivity. So it has quite a high conductivity of nearly 700. So all these things, give you information about the sort of quality of the water you've got and the effect on the crops that you're growing. This sort of water will have high levels of calcium and magnesium generally, so that's not going to be an issue with the crop. But the things you can expect with hard water are white deposits on the leaves, blocked nozzles, rising pH in the growing media. All of these things can happen. And you get precipitation on the leaves, which is quite common. But more and more these days I'm seeing more soft water, where people are collecting water and using it. And it has a similar pH often, 7.6, but the alkalinity is only 55. So this means the water's got less buffering capacity. It also means it's got a lower conductivity. So on the face of it, it's better water to use for young plants, as long as you bear in mind it's very low in dissolved solids, such as calcium and magnesium. So that could be a limiting factor with that water, and that's something we'll come back to later. But these are little things you can pick up, and in preparation for a crop or a season, you could bear in mind that you potentially could have problems with calcium and magnesium. And both these things are very important. Magnesium particularly, you see it in the older leaves. The plant is very good at recycling it into the newer leaves. So you would see it in the old leaves as a sort of interveinal yellowing between the veins. Calcium deficiency is increasingly common, but it's seen in the young tips. So you would see it very quickly, because it's immobile within the plant. Typical solutions you could take: you could use a hard water soluble fertilizer or a soft water product, which would have extra calcium and magnesium. The hard water product would reduce the alkalinity a little bit. So all of these things can help. There's more than one way to do it. But the key thing to look at is the growing media, that you get the right pH of the growing media, so that all the nutrients are in that blue zone, so they're readily available to the plant. And once you move out of that blue zone, you could potentially get deficiency problems. So if you had a growing media, a long-term crop with very hard water, you could expect the pH of the growing media to rise over time. So that's something to bear in mind if you weren't doing anything to the water. And it has a big effect. So if the pH rises, you typically see iron deficiency, and it happens very quickly in the young tips. There's a picture of a rose leaf, and it clearly shows the yellowing. The iron's used in the chlorophyll in the plant, so it can't be transported around the plant. So you'll see it commonly very quickly in the young growth. More and more, we're not just using peat as a growing media. We're using different other products as well, in terms of bark, wood fibre, coir, and sometimes green compost. They have slightly different properties than peat, and it's important to bear that in mind so you understand the differences you can get. The peat has quite a high buffering capacity, so it holds on to nutrients quite well. Some of these bark and wood fibre products, they leach nutrients more easily. They tend to be lighter products, so you can potentially get some nitrogen loss, but also lock up from these products in the short term. Coir can be a very difficult product. It's produced in third world countries, and the quality of the water they use to wash these products can be quite poor, can be quite salty. So you have to be very aware of sodium and chloride in these products, as well as high potassium levels. So again, it's important to check these things. Green compost is potentially a good product to use. The problem with the product is the variability of it, and the unknown quantity of what's in it, really. But if there was a safe source that didn't involve long cuttings, it would be better. But long term, there might be a solution. But you should be aware, of nitrogen can be locked up with some of these products. So it's important to compensate for that. And you can see a Lanister on the left grown in a peat-based compost, and then one grown with 30% wood fibre. And you can see the yellowing there. If that's not compensated for, you will get a loss of growth. So these are things that can be anticipated in terms of growing. So the pH is critical, and it depends on various factors. One of the key things with the peat-based compost is that you add lime to raise the pH from typically 4 to maybe 5.5. And in doing so, you add calcium and magnesium in the lime. When you start to use less peat, you need less lime. So particularly with peat-free products, there'll typically be a third as much lime in there as there would be with a peat-based compost. So in that situation, you've got less calcium and magnesium available. So again, it's something to consider. You might need to supplement that, particularly if you had soft water. But the fertilizers you put on should be in balance. If you get things out of kilter and you add too much of one nutrient, you can affect the uptake of other nutrients. That's particularly true with things like nitrogen. Nitrate nitrogen will increase the pH. Ammonium nitrogen will decrease the pH. So most feeding programs would have a balance of the two to ensure that you got little effect on the pH. But irrigation has an effect as well, obviously. So this is one of the things we see with outdoor nursery stock. We get some quite wet events these days, and you get some heavy rain for a week. It can leach a lot of nutrients out of the growing media. So it's important to monitor these crops in those conditions and anticipate that it might need a top up, after a cool, wet period. But as I say, plants are very intelligent. They can take up nutrients themselves, but again, it's down to balance. So typically, most of the nutrients are cations, so they're positively charged, and they bind well to things like peat, but they will also bind to bark and coir and things as well. But if you apply too much of one nutrient, you cause competition to some of the other products. So it's important that they're in balance. You don't overdo the potassium, because it will affect the uptake of other ions. So how do we do this in practice? Well, we have a program called AngelaWeb, which gives us a good basis to start from. So we can look at your individual nursery water, the growing media, the crop, and then balance the inputs to make sure we're on the right track. And it takes into account the crop's needs, the water quality, the local climate, and whether you're using a controlled release fertiliser such as Osmocote, or you're using water solubles, or even a combination of the two. And using this sort of technique can get you into the right zone. It's very easy to pick up a bag of fertiliser and look on the back and it'll say apply so much in a tank, but how much are you actually applying of calcium and magnesium to the crop, and how much does it need? These are things that you need to know for your situation. So typically Osmocote is used. We've been developing the product for 50 years now. We're celebrating 50 years of Osmocote. There's a nice little brochure in your goodie bag. This gives you a bit of the history, quite an interesting product. But we've done a lot of work on it and we haven't stopped. We're moving forward. We're trying to make these products more renewable and more controlled in terms of release, matching the plant demand. So we'll keep moving forward with these products. The key thing we're trying to achieve is the dark green curve there. We're trying to match the plant demand, and we want to stay above that line so that we don't get yellow plants. We don't want to go too high up into the red zone where we can get damage to plants and inhibition of rooting, leading to more chance of disease and things like that. And that's what we work on. We use lots of techniques to manipulate the release of Osmocote. Typically, we want to reduce the release at the start, so a plant will establish better and release more at the end when the plant is more established and you're trying to market the product. And it's big and vigorous and has lots of flowers. So we use a dual coating. So we take an Osmocote granule, we put a wax coating on the outside of it, and this enables us to delay the release between 6 weeks and 3 months, depending on the product. Um, we call the product high end or protect, depending on the percentage that we add. So if we use protect, it won't release for 3 months. So you could pot a crop in the autumn and it wouldn't start releasing until the spring. So it's a really efficient over winter nutrient, particularly if you were growing, you know, we do get some sunny days in the summer. If you were growing it under a cold frame or a cloche or something where it got quite hot, you wouldn't really want nutrients being released, and that's the key time to use it. The high end is very popular now. We double coat 25% of the particles, so we can delay the release, and it gives us the little blue curve there. So for the first 2 months we get a reduced release, and then after 2 months we get an enhanced release. And this is what gives you the better quality, got more nutrients available at the end of the crop, get less leaching, and the plant, you know, can make use of those nutrients. It's not being released at the start, you know, when the plant hasn't got much requirement for it, when it's busy rooting out. But we can match the release pattern to local climate data, you know, glasshouse computers and all sorts of things to give the actual release of the product. And then we can work with you, look at the potting date and the sales date, and make sure that the length of the product, the longevity matches your sales date, and also the release is as you want it. So in this particular case, potting in the spring and selling before Christmas, you know, a 5 to 6 month product would be fine. The 8 to 9 month product, you know, is going to go on longer than you actually need it with that crop. So you can get more fertilizer release, you know, for the same money and get a better quality. You might be potting in the autumn, and you might want a lower release with the dark green curve and a higher release next spring, and that's something we can do with the high end. And these are things that we can model individually. We've now produced a new high K Osmocote with the dual coating that enables us to delay the release of the potassium until later in the crop, you know, when the plant wants to flower. It gives us very compact growth, lots of branching, nice healthy plants that are easy to market, particularly good for perennials. You don't get them too long, you get lots of flower on a compact plant. We've mentioned calcium and magnesium, which are very important. If you're short of them, how could you improve the situation? Well, we have a product called Osmocote Calmag, which can supplement the Osmocote or the water-soluble products you're using, because calcium is very important to the plant, and as I say, it's carried in the transpiration stream, the water going up through the plant, and it can be restricted at certain stages of growth. So it's important to supply adequate levels right the way through the crop. And we typically see it in nursery stock in terms of cytisus and roses. Again, you see this sort of browning of the tips of the leaves. It's quite common. You see it particularly in primroses in the autumn. When you get very humid conditions, there's not much transpiration flow through the plants, and then right on the tips of the leaves you'll get calcium deficiency. So by anticipating that, you can add extra calcium and magnesium into the plant and get over that problem, because you're not having to water to supply those nutrients. So it's a really simple thing you can do. It can work very well with laurels. You get very tough leaves. It gives them good protection, strong growth, and it can work well. We use it a lot with buxus. You get very healthy growth. The plants are much stronger, and they seem to get less disease by being more healthy. And that's by matching their needs and making sure there's enough calcium, you know, in the crop and available all the time. Iron is one of the key things I come across. There's lots of crops that exhibit iron deficiency, again yellowing in the tips, and it's strongly affected by the pH. So with rising pH, you know, it's typically seen, you know, in lots of crops, you know, will show it as a bright yellow new growth. You can quickly fix it by using a foliar feed, but it's really a temporary effect. And there might be other reasons for it. So the plants might be sitting very wet. They might have lost some root tips from disease. So that's always a good time to look at roots and have a look at the plants. But some crops are very iron demanding, particularly things like petunias and primulas, and you see it very clearly in the new growth. So this can be supplemented to make sure you get good growth. Some of the plants that have the strongest demand for iron are grasses and bamboos. And we did a trial here where we added osmocote iron, and I think you can see the dark green imperatus. It's a blood grass, and you typically see them growing on nurseries with sort of these yellowy leaves. But when you improve the supply of iron, you get a really dark green leaf. It's quite dramatic. So, we're looking at the total fertiliser demand, whether it's from osmocote, maybe supplemented with water solubles, or just water solubles. There's various ways to look at it. We have a whole range of products that we can bring to the table, specific to your crops, and we're happy to help and talk about these things. So thank you very much.